according to the IPAC tracker, Tulsi Gabbard got 39,950 US dollars. Marco Rubio got $1 million from pro-Israeli interest groups. With the IPAC lobby being so strong and the various other pro-Israeli groups being, would this then have further ramifications on once Trump gets into office? Even if he, the candidates that we have talked so far, he can fire them. But the IPAC lobby is stronger than that.
PAC might be able to save its money, that it might not necessarily need to be spending this because the Republican Party ideologically, especially the evangelicals, are so pro-Israel that they would have pro-Israel positions almost for free. Now, AIPAC, of course, can do this where they can lobby for specific policies. And I think that there is a strong incentive for them to try to keep good relations, personal relations between particularly politicians they like in Israel, like Netanyahu and Likud, and the Republican Party. And that's becoming more and more important because the Democrats and Likud now have a wider gap. And I think in the future, there will be more tensions between Likud and the Democrats with future administration. I think that AIPAC is probably going to need to gauge and alter its strategy to be a party-to-party sort of political strategy rather than a country-to-country strategy. The bipartisan lobbying will become less effective, particularly with the Democrats in future cycles, because that is part of the narrative right now. It's part of the autopsy of what went wrong. And of course, there's plenty of Democrats who are saying, maybe we should have been tougher on the Israelis. Maybe we should have been tougher on Netanyahu. That might have altered some of our turnout numbers. Maybe it didn't change anything, but certainly backing Netanyahu as much as we didn't gain us anything.
Morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. My name is Dr. Shubha Chaudhary, and this is Middle East Insights platform. And to everyone who is watching it on YouTube, I would request you to please like and subscribe and the entire razzmatazz of it. Today, we are going to talk about Trump versus Biden, US foreign policy for Israel. Now, a lot of developments are happening. The Israeli president recently met American President Joe Biden, and a lot of changes are taking place as we move forward. So to throw more light on that, we have an expert joining from Pennsylvania, where Trump actually got his education from, and there's so many assassination attempts took place. So his name is Ryan Bohl. He's a senior Middle East and North African analyst at RANE Network, which is Risk Assistance Network and Exchange in Pennsylvania, US. He's also a geopolitical thinker, educator, writer, very hardcore animal lover, and he is a very, very nuanced expert on the conversations that we are going to have today. So first of all, sir, I would like to welcome you for Middle East Insights platform and the privilege of your time. And
Thank you for having me.
Now we'll straightly deep dive into what happened yesterday in US. So my first question is that Trump has started picking up members for his cabinet. His first choice, I have questions on at least 4 or 5 people, though they have to be ratified by the cabinet. Or the Senate, the Senate, yeah.
Yes.
So my first question is that Matt Gaetz from Florida, he has been allegedly involved, he has been selected as the Attorney General by Trump. He has been involved in allegedly illicit drug use, misusing state identification records, obtaining impermissible gifts, using campaign funds for his own personal use, and sadly also involved in 2020 in child sex trafficking and statutory rape. Do you think that he's the right representative, or what were the other options for Attorney General that Trump had?
Well, it's not clear who else was on the short list. What is certainly clear is that many Senate Republicans and professional Republicans aren't a big fan of Matt Gaetz. He's not popular within the party for the scandals that you've been referring to and the criminal charges that he's still facing. He is a political liability. It's important to note, though, he comes from a district in Florida, which is very, very Republican. It's very hard for the Republicans to lose that seat. And that's part of the reason he's been able to stay in power, is because he hasn't been able to face a competitive election in a very long time. But his virtue to Trump is that he is incredibly loyal to the Trump administration, to the Trump movement, to what Trump believes. Trump has a very loose set of beliefs, not a really specific set of beliefs, but he very much strongly demands formal loyalty from his subordinates. And one of the reasons I think Gaetz was chosen was because back in 2017, Trump's first attorney general, Jeff Sessions, was chosen because he was a traditional Republican. He was very conservative, but Sessions stood up to Trump a fair bit. There was a lot of fighting between the two, and eventually Trump fired him. And that was because Sessions was he wanted to follow the law, he wanted to follow the procedures, he wanted to stick within the traditional Republican Party for their policy aims. And Trump didn't like that. Trump he doesn't respect institutionalism. He doesn't respect necessarily law and order, obviously. He doesn't particularly care about procedures. He cares about results. And that's the kind of attorney general that he wants. He wants an attorney general who he can tell, hey, go arrest this person. And that attorney general will at least make an attempt to do so. Jeff Sessions wasn't willing to do that. I think Matt Gaetz is much more likely to do so.
And he's also younger. He's almost, I think, 42, 43 years old, right?
Right. And his inexperience and youth is something that Trump is going to lean on. The idea that he hasn't been so co-opted by the so-called deep state, the idea that this guy is very young, he's not a lawyer, he doesn't have any real legal background. They are putting him in charge because he's most likely to follow orders and to carry out the priorities of this administration, whatever those priorities are. And of course, Trump has threatened to arrest every political opponent he's got under the sun. I think he wants an attorney general that will take those threats seriously.
So, we have had podcasts on Middle East Insights on Trump 2.0, but as an American, how did the election day and the result unfold for you?
Oh, well, here we are in Pennsylvania, so we are in a suburb which was politically key for whoever was going to win. It was a surprise in some ways and a surprise in not. It was a surprise because, Trump was a known quantity with a lot of problems. He, of course, ended the January 6th insurrection. He had the 2 impeachments. He oversaw COVID response, which was a disaster in many ways. It wasn't like 2016, where it was like kind of a toss-up where people could be excused for not necessarily knowing what Trump represented. But at the same time, Kamala Harris was running on the backdrop of high inflation. That was the result of a lot of global events, but it was high inflation. A lot of people were very upset about that. They didn't necessarily know where it came from or even necessarily cared where it came from, and they were looking to punish the incumbent party. But I think what surprised me the most was that in 2022, the Republicans were supposed to win big at the midterms in Congress, and they didn't. And in fact, the Republicans had some losses in some places that were notable. And so that created a sense on the Democratic side that maybe 2024 could be similar. And as I think what turned out is that the people that Trump relies on, they don't turn out for any election other than him. They won't turn out for midterms. They might not understand the midterms. They might not care about the midterms, but they certainly care about him. And there was enough for him to get over the line. And then it was also a question of the turnout for the Democrats, which is definitely down from what it was in 2020. We're still counting the final numbers to know exactly how down it was. But a lot of folks stayed home. So it wasn't so much that Trump won new voters, although he probably won a few new voters, but that a lot of people stayed home. And I think there's still a lot of dissection as to why that happened.
Yeah, that is, I mean, Pennsylvania specifically was the most key components, algorithm or the missing puzzle for the entire campaign results.
Mm-hmm.
And no one has become, as far as I know, no one has become a president of US if they have not won Pennsylvania.
I would have to double. No one in the 21st century.
Yeah.
In the 20th century, this is a critical state, and it's because of the way our electoral college works. This is one of the few states that changes its mind from election to election, and therefore we become a lot more important as a result.
Yeah, that's true. Now, my second question is Tulsi Gabbard.
Right.
She is a soldier, a veteran. She was first from the Democrat Party, then turned Republican. She is hardcore on Islamic terrorism in Middle East.
Mhm.
She was the director of national intelligence. She was the first woman to enter or to work in the Kuwaiti military facility. She also got appreciation from the Kuwaiti National Guard. She has been against Trump on a couple of issues. The first issue is that when it came to in 2017, Tulsi Gabbard goes to Syria and Lebanon.
Mhm.
And she states that there is no evidence that Bashar al-Assad used chemical warfare on the citizens.
Mhm.
Somehow that was pulled out from the news, and then that was, slowly became, obsolete. Also, she was openly against Trump's decision in 2020 against the Baghdad attack, which led to the killing of Qasem Soleimani. At the same time, she is very pro-Israel.
Mhm.
How do you, because yesterday on Twitter specifically, or X, everyone went really, they were questioning Tulsi's selection on several fronts, on her changing her parties, on her being a political commentator, on her being, very. And the second question I'll ask you about what most of the people have a problem with. But now, how do you, as an American and as an analyst of Middle East, see her as a figure in the next 4 years?
And I think I will say this for all the cabinet picks. We saw the first cabinet in the first administration where Trump had personality problems with many of these key figures, and eventually most of them were fired or resigned. Very few of them. I'd have to double check and see the very short list of people that managed to make it from 2017 to 2021. Tulsi Gabbard is one of those people that I would say potentially could run afoul of Trump at one point because she does have strong beliefs on this sort of neo-realist alternative worldview of what the world should look like. She is skeptical of intervention in Ukraine. She was skeptical of intervention against Assad for the reasons you mentioned. She was saying that the chemical weapons attacks didn't happen. And she's skeptical of a new war in the Middle East or pretty much anywhere. At the same time, Trump can be very hawkish very suddenly. He can escalate very quickly, like he did against Qasem Soleimani. He obviously conducted airstrikes against Syria twice in 17 and 2018 for the use of chemical weapons. He wasn't a chemical weapons skeptic. And so those are gaps in which if we see, say, Russian forces use chemical weapons in Ukraine, Gabbard is more likely to take the line that it didn't happen or that it wasn't severe or that it wasn't America's problem. Trump may be much more inflamed by the use of chemical weapons in the future than she is, and that could create some sorts of clashes. So her position within the administration is signaling he's trying to run on this idea, or he's trying to govern on this idea that he's going to, quote unquote, end the wars. And of course, that's a very broad-based, very difficult thing for an American president to do. But he wants to end the war in Gaza. He wants to end the war in Ukraine. He wants to prevent a war with China. And so he wants a person like Gabbard on his cabinet because she's been relatively consistent against intervention. She is against American military adventures abroad. And that's kind of what her brand has become. And that's what she discovered she could build up her career on. And as a result, now she's being considered for a cabinet post. But Trump doesn't totally believe in non-intervention across the board. There are ways to provoke Trump into military action. We have seen it before. We will see it again. And there's already places where Trump must act militarily. For example, with the Houthis in Yemen, he can either abandon the Red Sea and let the Houthis continue to harass shipping there. But if he does so, it's a big prestige blow to the United States. And I tend to think that he won't do that. I tend to think that he will escalate in Yemen and conduct larger airstrikes and maybe even some sort of special forces maneuvers on the ground in that country. And if he does so, that's going to create some distance between him and Tulsi Gabbard, because Gabbard, at the end of the day, will be opposing that just on the general grounds that the U.S. shouldn't be intervening anywhere at all.
Yeah, and for our viewers, I want to say that Tulsi Gabbard is not Indian, though the first name Tulsi she comes from a Samoan family background. It is an indigenous community. And the mother gave the name Tulsi when the mother started like giving Hindu names to her children to as they started following Vaishnavism
Mm,
or the worship of Lord Krishna or that kind of sect, but they are not actually Hindus or Indians. So this is
mm,
something which I want to clarify. My second question regarding Gabbard is what everyone is going. There's a massive hullabaloo about Hillary Clinton in 2017. I guess, stated 2017-18 stated that Tulsi Gabbard had strong relations with Russia.
mm.
There are assumptions that the Russian deep state will now control the intelligence apparatus of US if
Mm,
Tulsi Gabbard comes into action. As far as my research is, Tulsi Gabbard then had a court case against Hillary.
mm,
But then suddenly, after the COVID, her reason for pulling out was that in the post COVID world, we should look for other options or other issues that demand more attention rather than this case.
mm, mm.
So, these allegations, the Russian factor with Tulsi Gabbard, how do you perceive it?
Well, first, it's driven by Gabbard's own ideological inclinations, and there's this angle both on the far left and the far right in the United States that the U.S. should be closer to Russia, that they should be partners, if not allies. That's something that kind of unites the far right and the far left. And she kind of was positioning herself as the far left at one point. Now she shifted more rightward. But that was something that on the fringes, a lot of people who think about foreign policy were like, well, why isn't the United States friends with Russia? It's a major country. It's a nuclear power. Why do we care about what happens to little tiny countries like Ukraine? So it's like this neo-realist framework of the United States should partner with Russia. There's an ideological gap, but it's not nearly as insurmountable as during the Cold War. Certainly the Russians aren't trying to bring communism to the United States or anything like that. So they make the argument that Russia and the US should be closer. And she is sympathetic to that narrative. At the same time, the allegations about whether or not she takes orders from the Russian intelligence services, I would tend to think that our intelligence services would have firm information on that if it was true. But the idea that she is sympathetic to a lot of Russian-backed influencers, to a lot of Russian-backed networks, I think that's relatively easy to prove. And that's not the same as saying she takes orders from it, but it has a lot to do with the fact that they have mutual aims, that the Russian intelligence services want either for there to be political chaos in the United States, or they want the United States to become friendlier to Russia. So she's somebody who's more likely to retweet something that might be coming from one of those networks. She's more likely to interact with somebody who's coming from one of those networks, because at the end of the day, I think their goals are similar enough that allows them to be, maybe not totally trusting partners, but birds of a feather, so to speak,
Yeah.
where they're able to get along because they both kind of want the same thing.
Now, it's very interesting because Trump himself has very, this very, I don't know how to put it, but a very different kind of relationship or bromance with Putin.
Mm-hmm.
And the case even of Stormy Daniels, and the entire book Russian Roulette talks about how Trump had gone to Russia, giving the details even of the hotel and why Putin didn't meet him and all of that. It's a very good storytelling experience or in that way. But now I come to the next candidate whose name was revealed. It was not much of a surprise, but Marco Rubio,
Mm-hmm.
as a Secretary of State,
Mm-hmm.
again comes from Florida.
Mm-hmm.
He comes from a Cuban American family. There has been a lot of contestation on, that initially he said that his family had to leave Cuba because of Fidel Castro, but then it was actually proved wrong. And then he said that it's the family whore or law or whatever. And then this kind of, cases are going against. But at the same time, when it comes to Middle East, in 2011, Marco Rubio supported the ouster of Gaddafi.
Mm-hmm.
And he's very hardcore critical of China and Iran.
Mm-hmm.
He's very anti-Hamas. He's completely against any kind of ceasefire.
Mm-hmm.
But what disturbs me is that in 2016, he ran against Trump.
Mm-hmm.
and they both were mudslinging each other. Trump was calling him Little Marco, and he was calling him Small Fingers.
Mm.
So, what changed that suddenly, a competitor becomes your Secretary of State?
Yeah. And I mean, it's a fair question. Like, there's a lot of that's happened in the Republican Party over the past 8 years, where his former opponents have now become loyal allies, and it has a lot to do with the fact that the Republican Party itself has changed tremendously in the past 8 years, and it was probably changing before even that. Probably 10 to 12 years ago, it had fundamentally shifted from its Ronald Reagan 1980s version of itself, and it was probably pretty close to being Trumpian by as early as 2012. And that's probably one of the reasons Mitt Romney didn't do very well, is because he wasn't meeting the expectations of what the base had become. Marco Rubio has ambitions to remain in power and to have influence, and to do so means accommodating Trump. And Trump finds it very easy to forgive people when they show this unrequited love and this unrequited loyalty. Rubio has done a pretty bang up job of making it clear to Trump that he supports him, that he backs him. I don't believe that Rubio voted to impeach him ever, shielded him from the January 6th consequences.
Yes.
All of the things Trump was looking for him to be appointed. And Rubio also factors in very much for what Trump's likely migration strategy is going to be, which will be focused, of course, on Latin America. That's one reason to choose Rubio, especially from Florida. It's also to prepare to use Rubio, who is relatively flexible ideologically, to try to force these countries throughout Latin America to be part of the solution to America's migration crisis and be much more hard line towards blocking migrants from moving up. Specifically in the Central American countries, I would expect the Trump administration to be very tough on those countries to force migrants from places like Venezuela to be stuck in those countries rather than get to Mexico. That was something they were doing in the 2010s, the late 2010s, and I expect Rubio will be the vanguard of a new effort, a renewed effort like that. Now, Rubio being a hawk on China and Iran and pro-Israel, that all aligns broadly with Trump's goals. Rubio will be restrained from being an interventionist, I think, in most of those cases. But it certainly means that Rubio is not going to force a ceasefire on the Israelis unless the Israelis want one themselves. He's not going to stop the Israelis from escalating against the Iranians unless the Israelis are choosing to do this on their own. For the Israelis, this is proof that they are going to have a free hand to reshape the region however they want. While for actors like Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran, they know that their response to Israel has to be more brazen, I think, and more direct than what they've been doing so far, because they've more or less lost the United States. Under the Biden administration, their restraint could result in pressure from the United States on Israel to restrain themselves. Under Trump, there won't be any restraint on the Israelis, not imposed by Washington. And so they have to figure out ways to pressure Washington in alternative ways. And so Rubio is supposed to be part of that strategic shift that is basically saying, for Israel, you can do what you want, you can do it however you want, as long as you don't infringe on core American interests in the region, which is energy, which is trade, which is American security. They don't care about Israeli security so much as they care about American troops' security. And Rubio is there to send that signal.
So, sir, what actual power does the Secretary of State actually have in terms of like the American politics?
Basically, he's allowed to negotiate treaties and come up with deals. They all have to go through the approval of the president. And if it's a treaty, it has to go through the Senate. So if there are talks between the United States and Iran over Iran's nuclear program, it's going to be Rubio who will be heading that up that effort. He'll probably appoint special envoys to go do it as well, but eventually be the foreign minister of Iran and Rubio sitting down to hammer out the final details, which would then either go to the president to be approved, and if it's a treaty, go through the Senate in the United States to become a formal law that a future president would have a lot of difficulty undoing. So that's more or less what his primary job is. And what's interesting about the Trump administration in term one, and what will likely be true in term two, is that these cabinet members often have a lot of leeway to do whatever they want because Trump's interests are very limited. He cares broadly about Israel's security and it being strong, and it doesn't really go much further than that. He doesn't necessarily have a strong opinion on should Israel annex the West Bank, or should Israel take over southern Lebanon, or what should happen to Gaza. He doesn't think about things along those lines. He just says, end the wars, and that's pretty much his political position, is end the wars. So that gives Rubio some leeway to deal with things like Israeli annexation because Trump isn't paying attention, and he'll sign whatever Rubio negotiates or decides to come along with. It gives him leeway to figure out how to manage the Gulf Arab states and their relations with China. Trump is anti-China. He is pro-cheap energy. And beyond that, he doesn't particularly care how Rubio will be managing the relations with the Gulf Arab states. So he will have the ability to put his own imprint on a lot of these deals in places where Trump doesn't have any interest and where he just trusts his Secretary of State to manage things on his behalf.
That's actually, it's very scary because as I started researching on all these candidates, the kind of lack of experience in foreign policy was very palpable. The complete lack of foreign policy or the understanding, like terming oneself as hawk or dove, it's okay. But in terms of, I think apart from Tulsi Gabbard, who had grassroots experience in Middle East, but most of them don't.
Yeah, right. And I think that's going to be the biggest hurdle. Last time the hurdle was that he hired a lot of experienced people who didn't believe in what Trump believes, and they put the brakes on a lot of his policies. And it took him about 2 years to shake most of them out. Now he's putting a lot of, for the most part, inexperienced people into key positions who are highly loyal to him, while at the same time saying that he's going to change the civil service. He's going to fire all these government bureaucrats and replace them with loyalists. All of that is going to create a different kind of paralysis caused by this purge of the government and being led by inexperienced people as well. So there's going to be policy chaos here that I don't think this country has seen since the late 1800s, because it used to be routine that governments would do this in the late 1800s until they passed, I believe it's the Pendleton Act, which makes it so that the civil servants are protected from being fired by presidents. He wants to get rid of those Pendleton protections. And if that's correct, I'm trying to remember if that's the correct terming, but there's a specific law from the 1800s that means you can't just fire people and replace them with your loyalists. And he wants to reinterpret that and get rid of a lot of people. Well, that takes time, that takes hiring, that takes money. And in the meantime, there's going to be a lot of chaos as a result. And I think during the first term as well, it was very slow to appoint ambassadors to countries Trump doesn't care about. There were a lot of vacant ambassador posts around the world, which weakened America's diplomatic influence and web globally. And that's probably something else that will likely happen, a version of that, where because Trump is so hyper-focused on Mexico and on China and probably on Israel and Iran, that means for places like Turkey and Brazil and Argentina and even Russia might get overlooked by an administration that has these really big pet bugaboos abroad, while they're also facing down all the domestic challenges of trying to get the machine to run for them.
That's actually, that kind of policy paralysis is going to be very difficult for the Americans, because there can be certain kind of, not exactly civil war, but a certain kind of alienation of the public who are now wanting more of economic benefits and are cushioning for their own, problems, economic problems that they face.
Right. And then when some of these federal services are inevitably interrupted, things like veterans benefits, Medicare, Social Security, if those start to hit hiccups, many people will certainly resent it and they will hold Trump responsible for it. But he's going to be a one-term president. He can't run after this. So he may not all that much.
No, he said that, I took 900 rallies and it was so sad on the 900th rally to say that I can never run again. So sad. Yeah. And this is actually what he said, that, I was like, okay, very good. I have bought a television just to watch you. But now coming to completely Middle East. Yeah. Director of CIA, John Ratcliffe. He was former director of national intelligence. He was in control of all the US spy agencies during the COVID time. He is strongly against Russia and very, very critical of Islamic extremism. He has various ways of surveillance. He is a part of the deep state. So John Ratcliffe, as the director of CIA, I don't know what William Burns feels right now, but John Ratcliffe, what kind of a choice is he?
Well, I think at least at the moment, it's more of a traditional choice, and maybe a prelude to the fact that Trump may diminish the CIA's standing or capabilities, that he may be looking to rein them in. Because remember, he has a very bad relationship with the intelligence services. He did
Yeah.
during his first term. He did while he's out of power. He blamed them for the Russiagate scandal, where he was, accused of being a Russian asset. And so this may be a prelude to him saying that the CIA isn't necessarily relevant, and I don't necessarily care who runs it. But again, looking for loyalists, loyalists who are willing to stick with his broad policies, particularly abroad, because what the CIA is going to be looked at for is not so much reshaping the foreign chessboard, so to speak, being anti-Russian, anti-Iranian, etc. It's going to be about being a weaponized institution to serve Trump's domestic interests. So that's things like intelligence on cartels, because that's very important to his base in Mexico. So doing that sort of intelligence work, finding criminal gangs, finding, and of course, hunting down terror groups. Trump is going to definitely want to kill as many terror leaders as he can, because that just boosts his poll numbers. And then it's also about reshaping that institution to become more loyal to Trump's overall goals and to no longer leak information that is embarrassing to Trump when he takes phone calls from leaders that he probably shouldn't, or he shares secrets with leaders that he probably shouldn't, which I think is going to be inevitable. Like, he did it once. There's no reason to believe he won't do it again. He's going to be looking to bring the CIA to heel. And of course, the CIA is also widely despised by his base. They see the CIA as behind all sorts of plots and conspiracies and things like that. And so they'll be looking to diminish the agency however they can. They blame it for everything from JFK's assassination to every coup that's
Yeah.
ever happened on the
Yeah.
world. It's a very conspiratorial mindset that they've got towards the agency. But Trump indulges that. He kind of believes in it. And, it wouldn't be an enviable job to be running the CIA under Trump, in large part because it's going to be a scapegoat for either when things don't go well, or when things do go well, Trump will be taking credit from it. And it's also a major target for like this institutional reshaping that Trump wants, where agencies like the FBI and the CIA aren't disloyal. They are loyal to Trump, even if they're no longer efficient.
Yeah, because like even if I don't know how much Biden, even if he's saying that he's going to finish or have the ceasefire talks, if after January 20th, it's
And
Ratcliffe heading the negotiations.
well, that's a good question, because basically what Trump has said is, I want the war over by the time I'm in office. That's what he told Netanyahu reportedly. And so I think in some ways, Trump wants Netanyahu to do it on his own, to de-escalate and declare these missions, this war to be over by the time Trump comes in. It's going to be very hard to do because the militants all get their own voice and their own say in it. And there's not much reason for them at this point to necessarily accede to that. It would be a major political defeat for Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran to de-escalate fully and allow the Israelis to claim victory and to allow Trump to claim victory. That will just embolden the hawks, particularly in Israel, who are now looking to, systematically eradicate Iran's network of influence throughout the region, as well as probably go after its nuclear program and its missiles, if not the Islamic Republic itself. So it's when he is setting up the expectations for how the region is supposed to behave when he comes into power. He's also kind of setting up his first early failures because these are such, as you noted before, lack of foreign policy experience. He's got some as president, but we saw how that would go. He treated everything with a blunt, kind of like with a hammer, even when that might require a scalpel. That was how he preferred to approach things. I think that that's going to be the first areas where he's going to be frustrated and confounded, is that these ceasefires, even if they are declared and agreed to, aren't very stable or tend to destabilize and fall apart, because at the moment the conditions on the ground just they're not conducive to an end in the fighting in the region.
Yeah, I mean, like, yes, it's completely the entire algorithm of ceasefire. Now, Qatar basically has, even though it has backed out from, asking Hamas to leave and trying to cut off communication from both parties to put pressure. But according to the recent update that I have, that the hostage family members met Qatari officials in Washington, and they were able to Qatar basically ensured them that they will ensure that the ceasefire takes place, even if they are not diplomatically on the table or they are putting pressure right now, things will be better. And these are very, even Mia Shems, when one of the hostages who was released, when she came out and she said that where was UN? Why was UN not talking about the hostages? And then there's another footage in which she is actually saying that the Qasim brigades that had abducted her behaved very politely. She was well fed. So the entire policy paralysis is there in Israel also, after Netanyahu firing Yoav Gallant, and he considers that he'll fire everyone who's in the mafia, like a mafia around him. So that is his, so that is quite, it's happening at the same time, simultaneously.
Yeah. And on the Israeli side of things, they have their own imperatives that are independent of Trump. And they, of course, Netanyahu wants to have good political relations with Trump, which means not embarrassing him with an energy shock that reaches the gas pumps of the US. That would be the absolute red line for Trump. That would be the one thing that might inspire an arms cutoff of the Israelis from a Trump administration. But short of that, Netanyahu and the Israeli government are aware that at this moment they've dealt some damage to Hamas and to Hezbollah and to Iran. Those are not problems that have been solved completely, but if they keep pressing on those problems, they have a potential where they fundamentally reshape the strategic dynamics of the region to favor Israel, that suddenly Iran is no longer the big bad guy everybody is afraid of, but rather that it's Israel that everybody is afraid of and respects. And so when Israel does something like annex the West Bank, there's less backlash because the region ends up fearing Israel more in the face of developments like that. And that's really what Netanyahu's own political calculus is. He's long been a settler. He's long been pro-expansion and annexation since all the way back in the 90s. He's coming to the end of his career. And so having a region that is afraid to push back on this kind of ultimate goal of finally seizing control of the West Bank and reversing the disengagement from Gaza in 2005 and resettling the Gaza Strip, that would be the ultimate achievement for like a right-wing nationalist like Netanyahu. So now he has to interpret the American imperative of no gas station shock combined with his own imperative to be the great Israeli leader that expanded its territory and secured it in the region for however long, while defeating its rivals, its most powerful rivals in Iran and Hezbollah and Hamas. So what that line looks like, it's hard to say. But I think that that's going to be another area where the Trump administration, their lack of experience, as well as their blank check approach to Israel, is going to run into some issues. Because even if the Israelis declare ceasefire in Gaza, mission accomplished, they can declare ceasefires left and right. And there are signs that in Lebanon, they may actually declare a ceasefire unilaterally. They may decide we're now finished with our operations. It's a ceasefire now. It's time for us to negotiate the implementation of this ceasefire. The problem, of course, with that is that Hezbollah has all the incentive in the world to sabotage such efforts. And so too does Hamas if they do something similar in the Gaza Strip.
Yes. And now coming to the two most difficult announcements that were made yesterday. Mike Huckabee, the American ambassador to Israel. Mike Huckabee is the host of Huckabee or anchor at Fox News. He loves Israel. He is from, he's a former Arkansas, if I'm pronouncing the state correctly, minister.
Arkansas, yeah.
He's also a baptism minister, so a man of faith, quote unquote. He has led several paid tour visits to Israel in the past. In 2017, a CNN footage which was released stated him saying that there is nothing called as West Bank. It is Judea and Samaria. There's no one called as Palestinians. That's a very scary selection.
Yeah. Huckabee has embraced Israel's far right's approach and rhetoric towards the West Bank and towards Palestinians. He does not believe there is such a thing as a Palestinian nation. He, like the Israeli far-right minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, they argue that Palestinians don't belong there. They belong in Egypt or Jordan or Syria. They belong in those other Arab states nearby. There is no such thing as a Palestinian as far as they're concerned. And Huckabee embraces that. It is very likely that Huckabee is going to try to encourage President Trump to bless Israeli annexations in the West Bank and to bless the return of settlers to the Gaza Strip. That's at a minimum. That's like a baseline expectation. But with the far right in Israel now in power, now we have to ask these questions about what we would consider real ethnic cleansing. What's happened in Gaza has been a humanitarian catastrophe, but there's still that open question as to whether or not civilians could ever return to northern Gaza because of combat operations. And traditionally, the Israelis do allow civilians to return home. Under Huckabee and under Trump, there's a very real possibility that the Israelis who have displaced all these civilians keep them in southern Gaza in perpetuity. And then we have an actual ethnic cleansing situation where the population has been pushed out in favor of the return of Jewish settlers. And some of these other Palestinians in the south may be moved over to the West Bank. And Netanyahu may also enter negotiations with other Arab countries to take Palestinians, to send them abroad, to reduce the population in the West Bank, because that will increasingly emerge as an imperative of a more expansionist, aggressive, annexationist Israel. They have to balance the demographic books, because if they take control of Gaza and the West Bank and they have all those Palestinians still living there, Palestinians will outnumber Jews between the old mandate by not a significant margin, but they'll outnumber them. And they tend to be a younger population than the Israelis. And they don't have the security forces or the economy to permanently occupy and manage a population like that. Israel would turn into a version of North Korea on a long enough timeline if they are governing so many people. So instead, they have to find a way to get rid of them and to further divide them up into something like a reservation system. And I think Huckabee is going to be more or less on board with that, because we know his worldview is this evangelical, end of the world, apocalyptic worldview, where they believe that Israel will be a key ally of the Christian armies in the battle against the Antichrist during the phase of Armageddon. They believe that the existence of Israel is necessary to bring about the end of the world, which will send all the good Christians to heaven. That's something that he's a genuine, true believer in. Now, Trump, I very highly suspect, does not believe in that, doesn't care about that sort of thing, given his lifestyle and everything he's done. But he is reliant on that base for their votes, and they are so loyal to him that he's willing to hand them the policies that they want. Because again, he doesn't particularly care about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, except for the abstract of, I don't want war, I want to look like a peacemaker, not a warmonger. So Huckabee is very likely to oversee a push for annexation and all the consequences that entails.
Yeah, it's just look at the news, the kind of silent annexation of West Bank that is going on, especially in the fringe, the settler violence has become huge now. Not the IDF, the settler violence of those, Israeli settlers that are there in West Bank, in Hebron, in Jenin, hardly deported, or the media is not allowed in Gaza or in West Bank or Golan Heights. The second thing is that 82% of the Israelis in a recent survey stated that they do not want the Gazans to come back to north of Gaza.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I did see the same statement. I think the IDF then walked it back, but it was basically like an officer saying more or less what they were hoping is that the civilians wouldn't be able to return to northern Gaza. I think that becomes more likely to be formal policy, like that's a government war aim with the Trump administration's backing. That is something that the Israelis on the security front can argue. Northern Gaza is too dense, too heavily populated to be repopulated by anybody but Israeli settlers. It can be a giant Israeli military base with a few Palestinian refugee camps as enclaves. And that's what they've done in the West Bank, of course. They surround these towns with Israeli military bases and settlements to divide them up and make it hard to coordinate. But I do think also this is going to entail pushback from Palestinians, because while Gaza is exhausted, its economy has crashed, there's a humanitarian crisis, the West Bank, while its economy has certainly shrunk and been impacted, has nevertheless been relatively untouched by the Israel-Hamas war. And the idea of a full-scale uprising taking place in the West Bank, I think, is growing in probability, even as soon as the beginning of next year, because Hamas is still growing in strength there. Palestinian Islamic Jihad is still growing in strength there. Other militant groups like Lions Den are growing in strength there. Palestinian Authority itself if they're looking down the barrel of an Israeli government that's going to annex the territory or territories, and there's nothing they can do about it, that becomes more likely for the Palestinian Authority to have a crisis of faith, crisis of legitimacy. Some of the security forces break away and join the uprising, or the PA itself says, we no longer function, Israel's going to abolish us anyway, and then Fatah joins its militant wing, the Al-Aqsa Marwa Brigade, and becomes an open combatant against the Israelis. And if that happens, then the West Bank becomes a version of Gaza, except that it's a large geography. There's a lot more Israelis at risk there. And there is an outside chance that other Arab governments nearby, under those circumstances, aren't nearly as pro-Israel as they were during the Gaza war, where places like Jordan perhaps aren't as tight of a corridor to crack down on arms smuggling, and instead they're enabling arms smuggling because they might see an uprising against Israel as the only way to check Israel's far-right impulses.
No, that is, I think after Hezbollah, when they try to get out of Lebanon, they're going to focus on West Bank.
Mm-hmm. And they've escalated their military campaign there already.
Yeah.
And they're using airstrikes on the West Bank as well. But the West Bank is a more difficult territory for them to use their Gaza scorched earth tactics on, because Israeli settlers are so embedded in many of these cities. And that's one of those, another intifada in the West Bank is not only a problem that Trump can't solve. There will be no negotiating partner for him if there's another intifada for him to go to. There's no version of Arafat that can turn an uprising on and off in this case. But the other problem is for the Israelis is that this could be something that lasts for years and keeps them in emergency mode, and could be coinciding with attacks from Yemen and attacks from Lebanon, and even attacks from Syria and Iraq and Iran. This time an intifada would probably layer on the regional conflict rather than take place in isolation.
Yeah, and they have already invested $60 billion US.
Mm-hmm.
Even if Netanyahu is criticizing Iran of $2.3 billion being invested in it, but Iranian attacks did not have collateral damage.
No, not yet, of course. Yeah. And then that's the other thing we're watching for is, how does Trump respond to the Iranian-Israeli conflict continuing to escalate? Because Iran's got that imperative, right? They can't look weak in front of Trump. That could inspire an uprising. There are hawks within the administration that would like Rubio, to favor, they would back a rebellion against the Islamic Republic. That becomes more likely if they have a foreign policy failure abroad. So the Iranians are kind of stuck in a bad position where if they don't respond, it'll make them look weak. If they do respond, it could go too far and provoke an American reaction that they don't necessarily want.
Yeah, that's a very difficult situation, actually, because the entire, the list that was revealed yesterday is shocking at various levels. And the last most shocking is the Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff. He is a real estate developer. He is the golf partner of Trump. He's a massive donor for Trump's campaigning. In May, when Biden had tried to pause the shipment of 2,000 pounds bomb to Israel, Steve Witkoff used it as an opportunity for fundraising 6 to 7 figure donations for getting arms to Israel. He also says that his level of campaigning was so high that people used to call him saying, "How can we help President Trump?" Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, and others, the real estate elements. How do you see, first, what is the difference between, what is the power of the Middle East envoy?
So a Middle Eastern envoy, this is where they're going to be able to negotiate and come up with plans that will then go for presidential approval. Basically, this is Trump's way of saying we have a special renewed emphasis on these particular issues. So Rubio is going to be running around the globe, of course, but it'll probably be heavily focused on Latin America, which means there needs to be somebody doing the day-to-day work in the Middle East to try to restart talks between the United States and Iran, to try to push these ceasefires in Lebanon and Gaza, to try to hold together the alliances or the partnerships, and of course, try to negotiate Saudi-Israeli normalization. The problem all of these folks have is that they're bringing a real estate mentality to geopolitics, and it is not a very effective mentality to have. They're going to be viewing things very transactionally. They'll be viewing things very much, well, if I give you this, then I'll give you that. And right now, the mood in the Middle East is not about transactionalism and trade-offs. It's more about hardened ideological attitudes and developing advantages against each other. Particularly the trickiest partner they're going to have is Israel. Israel very much sees this as a 1967 moment where if they keep hitting their enemies, they will diminish them where they could buy themselves a decade or a generation of peace. That's how the Israelis currently see it, in addition to, of course, that long-held goal of annexing the region. And since they're not going to be tough on the Israelis, it's a question of what can they do to, say, get Saudi-Israeli normalization going again. Well, it's not much. There's not a lot that could get the Saudis on board with normalizing with a hawkish, aggressive Israel, particularly when it's more and more likely to cause an uprising in the West Bank, which could cause the whole region to have, its own domestic disturbances. And that could spread to places like Saudi Arabia. They're hyper aware that their population is very critical of what's going on.
Especially northern part of Saudi Arabia.
Mm-hmm. So that is going to be something that all of these special envoys and Jared Kushner and all the others, they struggled with it in the first term. They very much did. And they caused inadvertent escalations there too during that time period. Remember, Qatar was blockaded, and it was blockaded because Saudi and the UAE believed they had backing from the Trump administration that they didn't really. He never resolved that issue. That issue was resolved under the Biden administration. There was the abortive withdrawal from Syria in 2019 that prompted Turkish invasion. That was a major misstep. There was the Turkish currency crisis that was caused by Trump when he threatened to tariff that country over the detention of a pastor, Pastor Andrew Brunson, way back then. There's all of these issues where they have misstepped, in part because they believe that they can trade away interests, that everybody looks at the world the same way they do. They don't give much stock to the idea that people believe in religion or believe in nationalism. They think everything is for sale. And that mentality runs up against problems in negotiating with some of these partners. And, with Iran is probably the biggest one, because Iran's nationalism, its religious ideology, makes it so that it is not a negotiating partner suitable for kind of your secular materialists that the Trump administration is going to be made up of. They think that Iran should concede its nuclear program to get its economy on track, to get away from America. They don't understand that from the Iranian government's perspective, the economy is a worthwhile trade-off for foreign policy independence, for regime independence, for the expression of their ideological impulses internally. They don't think that the economy is worth trading away those aspects. And as a result, it makes it hard for anybody. I believe Brian Hook was possibly going to be given the special file for Iran. If they're not willing to come to terms with that reality, it means that we're probably going to see just years of talks and years of back and forth without actual breakthrough.
Wow, this is actually unnerving, because as one clarification which I would like to do, that when we are talking about countries, we are talking about the administration. We're not talking about the civilians. There's a difference between the civilians and the state.
Yes, exactly.
So that the same goes for Israel, same goes for Iran, same goes for most of the countries that we're talking about. I think Wikipedia has actually finally mentioned there's a genocide happening
in Gaza.
Yeah, I think just recently Wikipedia has mentioned, not that it's a big, accomplishment.
That is a major potential problem for the Trump administration. Not that they particularly care about, say, the International Court of Justice. They don't care at all about those norms, but their European partners do. And if the ICJ rules that Netanyahu is a former war criminal, and there are European sanctions that come along with it, and of course, Europe doesn't do sanctions all as one continent. They do it country by country. But if France and Britain and Italy and Germany are imposing sanctions on the Israelis, how does Trump combat that, given that he's supposed to be the most pro-Israel president ever? And the Israeli military is reliant on American arms, but they're also very reliant on German equipment as well.
Yes.
And for obvious reasons, the Germans have a lot of historical guilt that helps propel that relationship. But if there's a formal declaration that there's a genocide taking place in a court of law, international law, and the Germans are supposed to prioritize that over their historical guilt, and there may be a new German government next year as well, a stronger German government, depending on how the elections go, that creates a real problem, because Trump and all of his, the Huckabees and the others are going to have to see Europe is cutting off arms. Suddenly Merkava tanks don't have engines anymore. What can we do to counter this? What do we need to bring down on the Germans in order to force them to change this behavior? And of course, Trump is heavy on tariffs. He's heavy on economic threats. And there is a possibility, and this is what frustrates policy experts to no end, that Trump links something going on in Israel to its industrial policy with Germany.
Yeah, and it's also going to be difficult because once the diplomatic uh, facade of looking at Trump's administration changes, it would also impact how US is intervening in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And how they're expecting the European partners to send tanks, send missiles to Ukraine, and carry that forward.
Right. And so there, and that relationship where Trump is going to be trying to end the wars, so to speak, quote unquote. And with the Ukrainians, it's more likely to reduce support rather than strengthen support. Whereas with Israel, he's more likely to strengthen support rather than reduce support, in the belief that that's the best way to end the wars. That dynamic, that kind of incoherent dynamic where he's picking and choosing which partners he's got, is also going to create this, for the Middle East in particular, this feeling that all of these countries need to find alternative partners. And they already feel this way, right? Saudi Arabia is, and then the Gulf Arab states in general, are not exactly thrilled that Trump has been reelected. They don't want to return to the first term hawkishness against Iran that resulted in attacks on their oil facilities and escalation. And they don't want that. They're focused on their internal development, and they have a détente with Iran that they don't want upended. Trump could easily blow up that détente, quite literally, if the Iranians are harassing U.S. forces or ships or hitting an oil tanker, and Trump decides to make an example of them with a sudden airstrike on Iranian territory, which is now more likely, given that the Israelis have done so, and it didn't result in the end of the world. And after Trump is finished purging the Pentagon of people he considers disloyal, there could be a series of officers that are making the argument that we can strike Iran here and there without provoking an energy shock. And that's a danger that they could be taking that could cause a really rapid miscalculation that could really impact the Gulf Arabs. It may not impact the United States directly, but it could really impact the Gulf Arabs as Iran is seeking counters to this erratic and hawkish administration.
Yeah, and that is like, I recently was in Saudi Arabia, and what I realized that at the airports and at many places, the signs were in English, Arabic, and Chinese. And that was very interesting I was like, what, Chinese? And then there are a lot of Chinese businessmen that I saw in the visit. Also, the diaspora. Bangladeshis make the highest diaspora in Saudi Arabia, followed by Indians, followed by Egyptians, Pakistanis, Sudanese, those from the Levant, and many others. Saudi Arabia has to take care of the diaspora also, which is not just their population, but also the various diaspora from all over the world that resides there. And Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman has stated the term genocide. He is trying to have talks with Iran, the Arab League, the African Union. All of them are coming together to bring a united front, and all of that is very interesting because there's a certain kind of though in Riyadh there's a certain kind of what I felt. It was a certain kind of golden cage kind of situation where, because a lot of real estate development in Riyadh has been done by Americans. But there was a calmness before the storm, kind of, because we were scared when the airspace will lock out. Thankfully, it didn't. But at the same time, what is happening at the local level is that during every Friday meeting of Jummah, the local population who are pro-Palestine, they are voicing their concerns. The similar happened in Jordan when a man just self-immolated himself against their own government.
Yeah, and with radicalization, it usually doesn't happen overnight. You get a surge of anger, but then people fall back, they get suppressed by security forces, and then the real serious thinkers go underground and they start to organize, and then they become quite dangerous. And that takes time. And I do not think we have seen the end of the radicalization that has been caused by the Gaza war. There are lots of new militants that have been growing up and born. I don't think they'll adhere to the traditional jihadi Salafi ideology necessarily, although some will. Somebody's going to find a new narrative and a new message that's going to be a political challenge to a lot of these regional governments. There's always, the Arab Spring resolved nothing. All the conditions of the Arab Spring are still there. There is that very real possibility that under the Trump administration, there are serious uprisings in friendly countries. And his disinterest in human rights and disinterest in norms may result in these risings being crushed brutally, which would be a human rights disaster. But it also could provoke further unrest and further instability that, of course, could produce movements that go after the United States itself. And we've seen this history before. And the ingredients for it to be, at least in some forms, repeated, I think are still there.
Yeah. And the question from me, sir, is also the IPEC lobby. Mm-hmm. So according to the IPEC tracker, Tulsi Gabbard got $39,950. Mm-hmm. Marco Rubio got $1 million from pro-Israeli interest groups. We have Miriam Anderson, the widow of Sheldon Anderson, the casino magnate. She's worth $36 billion, born in Israel, drafted in the IDF. She studied microbiology in Tel Aviv, came out today. She's a very prominent figure when it comes to solving issues against drug addiction, creating awareness about drug addiction, many other things. She gave around $100 million to Trump campaign. With the IPEC lobby being so strong and the various other pro-Israeli groups being so strong, this under-the-table cash diplomacy that is happening. What the numbers that I'm quoting are from the IPEC tracker. The point here is that would this then have further ramifications on once Trump gets into office, even if he, the candidates that we have talked so far, he can fire them. But the IPEC lobby is stronger than that. It will continue to buy candidates. How do you see the connection or the relationship or the symbiosis or osmosis between IPEC lobby and the cabinet members and even the president in the coming 4 years?
Well, I think we talked about this before, but I almost tend to have the opinion that AIPAC might be able to save its money, that it might not necessarily need to be spending this because the Republican Party ideologically, especially the evangelicals, are so pro-Israel that they would have pro-Israel positions almost for free. Now, AIPAC, of course, can do this where they can lobby for specific policies. And I think that there is a strong incentive for them to try to keep good relations, personal relations between particularly politicians they like in Israel, like Netanyahu and Likud, and the Republican Party. And that's becoming more and more important because the Democrats and Likud now have a wider gap. And I think in the future, there will be more tensions between Likud and the Democrats with future administrations. I think that AIPAC is probably going to need to gauge and alter its strategy to be a party-to-party sort of political strategy rather than a country-to-country strategy. The bipartisan lobbying will become less effective, particularly with the Democrats in future cycles, because that is part of the narrative right now. It's part of the autopsy of what went wrong. And of course, there's plenty of Democrats who are saying, maybe we should have been tougher on the Israelis. Maybe we should have been tougher on Netanyahu. Might have altered some of our turnout numbers. Maybe it didn't change anything, but certainly backing Netanyahu as much as we didn't gain us anything. So is there a point in giving such blank checks to future Israeli administrations, particularly among younger Democrats? I think those conversations are happening. So for AIPAC, the future is really good for the next 2 years until Republicans face midterms in 2026. They will get more or less whatever they are asking for from this administration. They may not, again, like I said, they may not have to pay for it, really. Mike Huckabee is going to lobby for them on his own because they believe these same things. But they will need to adjust how they approach the Democrats, particularly as an opposition party starts to take over, and particularly as younger Democrats are altering their views of Israel. And then they are also going to be stuck with how a more far-right Israel is driving away Israeli Jews. And it's really important to
Yeah.
note that American Jews, sorry, American Jews. It's important to note American Jews overwhelmingly voted for Harris. And that is because here in the US, they're becoming critical of Netanyahu. They're critical of the far-right drift. And they know that in the Trump coalition's camp, there are the far-right neo-Nazis. There are the people that will attack synagogues and say anti-Semitic slurs. For Jews living in the US, the phenomenon that they face is anti-Semitism driven by the Trump phenomenon. They don't necessarily see things through the existential lens of Israel facing Hamas. And that's creating another divide. So for AIPAC also has to adapt to that they may not have the diaspora in the United States in their camp anymore.
Yeah, that's because the US has very ultra-conservative Jewish minorities also that are against the Israeli state.
Yeah, there are, and those certain,
and
I think
Zionists.
Yeah, there will be there, and those folks have existed since the beginning of Israel. Of course, they've religious grounds, but the idea of more and more secular Israelis becoming critical of Israel, maybe not to the point of saying there should be no Israel, but they are certainly already critical of Netanyahu. They generally don't like the far right and the Kahanists that are now in government. And if Israel is annexing the West Bank and is conducting ethnic cleansing campaigns, formal ethnic cleansing campaigns, open ethnic cleansing campaigns, if it's doing that, that's going to just further alienate these groups. And they are going to say things like, why are we supporting this version of Israel? This is not, they want a liberal democracy in Israel. If Israel becomes an illiberal democracy or becomes an illiberal autocracy, as it must if it's going to carry out ethnic cleansing campaigns, then that's something that will alienate this constituency probably for a generation, if not more.
Yeah, because Netanyahu is not Israel. Israel is much more diverse, and Jews are much more, like torchbearers of a lot of advancements in humanity. And because of this kind of ethnic cleansing and the ramifications of anti-Semitism, it's also difficult for Jews and their safety all around the world.
Yes, exactly. So, and that perception, I think, will deepen, particularly amongst younger Jews in Europe and in the United States. But also as they visit Israel, and if it becomes a religious nationalist state that in some ways, is looking more like the region, where many of these countries are religious nationalist states, and it's looking less like Europe, that also will alienate many secular Jews. And then there will be plenty of secular Jews within Israel itself who over time will think about relocating. Of course, they threatened to move out of the country during the judicial reforms in 2023. That trickle may expand over time, the more that Israel gets what it wants and kind of transforms itself closer to that far-right apartheid state that it's long been accused of.
Yeah, exactly. And the point also is that, be it Netanyahu, be it Nasrallah, be it Yahya Sinwar, be it Ismail Hania, my reading is that none of them really care about the lives of innocent people on any side of, the line.
Yeah.
And all of that is propaganda that is being used according to their own status quo. Yes,
and I mean, as the Israelis start to adopt that same mentality of like civilian casualties can be good if they benefit us, which is certainly a attitude of many militant groups, is that civilian casualties can be good if it generates outrage that then fuels our movement. Again, that's another thing that can drive a wedge between Israel and its key partners. The question, of course, for the Israelis in the long run is, can they adapt to this multipolar world that Trump is heralding in which the U.S. is not central to all international behavior? It's not the be-all, end-all of everything. So can Israel make partnerships with Turkey and with China and with Saudi Arabia and with Egypt and have alternative networks that as the U.S. maybe loses interest and changes its position, they have backups? And so that's an open question. It's a long-term question, but it's an open question too.
Yeah, and also like we are going to have a podcast day after on Trump's impact on India.
Oh well, yes, they see that's it. But I mean, last time Modi made him seem to find the way to flatter him in all the right ways, but that's not necessarily enough for Trump to alter policies towards India in a way that's favorable to it, because he's such a protectionist and such America first kind of guy. He's happy to have a massive crowd waving at him, but that doesn't necessarily cause him to follow through on policy unless he really cares about it. And Trump doesn't say a whole lot about India, does he?
Not really.
Yeah. So
Not really. The romance is only one-sided, unrequited love. But anyway, we will see what happens. So thank you so much, sir, for the privilege of your time.
Okay, no
And
problem. Rather,
I am very, very thankful to all the members who also joined at the middle of the night to hear. It was a very, like a very, very specialized conversation that we had today. So you would have to research a lot on that. But thank you so much for the presence. And I hope everyone on YouTube also likes and subscribes to our channel. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you.